Well, welcome to this symposium, Illustrated Poetry, Wordsworth and the 19th Century. The panel participants whose introductions are on the handout, so we won't be doing any lengthy introductions. We'll just be going through the panelists one after another. And the other side of the handout has a short selected bibliography of illustrated works of Wordsworth's poetry, along with a few other selected works, recent works about poetry and illustration. All the panelists thank the Yale Libraries, the Yale Center for British Art, Jessica Brantley, chair of the English department, Jane Bordier, also at Yale English, and their staff, all of whom have made this symposium possible. Mike Raymond is the mover of this symposium, and without him it never would have happened. So please let me give also personal gratitude to two people who have recently passed away. One is a man named Howard Gralla, G-R-A-L-L-A. Howard Gralla, who was an incomparable book designer, responsible for everything good in the illustrated Prelude for design purposes that Mike Raymond and I did. It was in fact Mike McHugh, another panelist, who introduced Howard Gralla to us. If ever anyone knew the intricacies and the aesthetics of book and illustration design, it was Howard. He received his degree from Yale. The second is Helen Vendler, whose afterword graces the illustrated Prelude, the 2024 edition. My colleague Helen died 1 year ago today, exactly, on the day that we observe Shakespeare's birth. Her criticism, including her book on Shakespeare's sonnets, will, I'm sure, outlive this century. I want also to thank David Godine, the publisher, who produced so many fine books, many of them illustrated, and Sue Raymond, the current director of Brandeis University Press. So each of our panelists, Paul Fry, Peter Manning, Mike McHugh, Mike Raymond, each has particular knowledge, but so do you. And so after the panelists are finished, we're going to have an opportunity for discussion and questions. And that will keep the panelists on their toes, and I, as the MC, will urge them a little if we seem to be lagging in time. We also want to give you the opportunity to look at books back on the tables if you haven't yet. And every one of those books you can pick up and look at. Don't be afraid to touch them or turn the pages. They are there for your perusal physically as well as by ocular design. For much of the last 100 years, the illustration of poetry, except illustration designed for young readers, has held, I think, a relatively low rank of scholarly interest, and arguably less popularity than it did from the later 18th century through the 19th, especially after the 1820s. But critical interest has revived, exemplified by, but certainly not limited to, some of the works on the selected bibliography that's on the handout. Works by Tess Goodman, Susan Matthews, Ian Haywood, and Tom Mowell. All of these were published in the last 7 years. So there's a clear revival of interest, I think, in this particular subject. Well, now for a story. It's a story about Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, their friendship, their poetry, and illustration. It's also a story about Yale to some degree. In 1932, English professor Chauncey Brewster Tinker purchased a remarkable item from the famous London dealer Bernard Quaritch, and later gave that item to Yale, now in the Beinecke. It reveals a little-known aspect of the friendship between those two poets, Coleridge and Wordsworth, and their famous lyrical ballads, as well as one of Coleridge's finest, though forever unfinished poems, Christabel. This item also discloses an interest in illustrating poetry, which blossomed in the 19th century, later adorning both Coleridge's and Wordsworth's verse. Tinker's gift is actually two letters, one enclosed in the other, and they are dated March 26th and March 27th, 1801. One of the letters, written by Coleridge, contains a proposal to illustrate Christabel, and Coleridge made the proposal himself. Wordsworth was writing to the publisher of lyrical ballads, Longman and Rhys, who had published lyrical ballads anonymously in 1798, and in late 1800 issued a second edition under, of course, Wordsworth's name only. Enclosed from Wordsworth's letter was Coleridge's to Longman and Rhys. And Coleridge in it is proposing that Christabel, since it was not going to appear in the lyrical ballads, which I'll get to in a minute, that Christabel be published separately by Longman and Rhys, and that it be done so illustrated with scenes from the Lake District, which is in fact the locale of the poem Christabel, a fact often lost on the people who criticize the poem and discuss it. Coleridge offers, for this poem, a friend of mine is now drawing for me, under my own direction, some head and tail pieces representing the particular scenes and places which are mentioned in the course of the tale, all of which he takes on the spot, meaning he draws them from being actually at those scenes. And they are from the wildest and most romantic parts of this country. Coleridge asks the publisher whether you would venture on the expense of having the little drawings engraved or cut in wood. The title of the poem, says Coleridge, is Christabel. Borrowdale features prominently in that poem as a place, and it is in fact the first place in the Lake District that Wordsworth and Coleridge ever visited together. So I think there's some deep personal associations going on here. Now, Coleridge was inwardly licking wounds, I believe. One previous October day in 1800, he had walked 16 miles to read the second and final, though unfinished part of Christabel to William and his sister Dorothy. William was seemingly first pleased. Dorothy says in her journal, "We were much pleased, much pleased." Nevertheless, almost immediately thereafter, Wordsworth falls ill and retires to his room and is there for a long while, meaning overnight and beyond. And within 2 days, he announces that he will not include Christabel in the lyrical ballads. It will not be there. He had already had a proof sheet printed up. Only 4 of these proof sheets survive, by the way. That's how we know that it was printed. All the rest were destroyed, but 4 survive. He had had a proof sheet printed up explaining, for the sake of variety and from a consciousness of my own weakness, I have again requested the assistance of a friend who has now furnished me with the long and beautiful poem of Christabel, without which I should not have ventured to present a second volume to the public. Well, he changed his mind. So Christabel was not going to be in the volume. As a substitute, Wordsworth wrote the poem Michael and did it quite quickly that fall. So now Wordsworth revised that sheet and dropped all mention of Christabel and simply implied that his friend's verse exhibited discordance with his own. Now, the nature of that discordance may or may not be only in style and subject matter, and Wordsworth may have felt that the cool reception given to the first version of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1798 meant that it might lower sales for the 1800 edition. Or he may have disliked the disturbing, emotional, sinister, and sexually suggestive scenes in Christabel, or the fact that it was set in his beloved Lake District with hints of a lesbian relationship, seduction, friendship between two men gone sour, and the real operation of evil. Hard to say. Wordsworth never gave a strict reason why he didn't want Christabel except to say it was discordant. Despite retaining some of Coleridge's poems, including a revised version of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Wordsworth published the second edition in his famous preface entirely under his own name, referring only to Coleridge as a friend. Now, Wordsworth may also have been wanting to set out in his own poetic career with resolution and independence, specific words that actually crop up in letters about his career repeatedly. He wants to pursue his career with independence. A few weeks before Coleridge had read Christabel to Dorothy and William, they had met a leech gatherer and talked with him. And that encounter led Wordsworth to write the poem entitled Resolution and Independence. Or perhaps Wordsworth rejected Christabel for all of these reasons. It's hard to say. Christabel is, in fact, the longest poem Coleridge ever wrote, and he never finished it. In the winter of 1801, Wordsworth's rejection of Christabel had sent Coleridge into a tailspin. I have very little doubt about that. He wrote to an acquaintance that Wordsworth is a true poet. I am only a kind of metaphysician. Coleridge's opium habit deepened markedly that winter. Now, in this letter of late March, the following spring, ironically enclosed in Wordsworth's own, Coleridge attempts to revive Christabel with illustrations. But it would be dormant another 15 years. That dual letter also reveals that Wordsworth's finances were pretty good and Coleridge's were not. And Coleridge had basically asked Wordsworth if he could include his letter to see if the publisher would publish Christabel so Coleridge could get money for it. In fact, Wordsworth agreed, in effect, to advance Coleridge money. Longman and Rhys never published Christabel. Coleridge sold it for publication in 1816. He was in part reacting that year to Wordsworth's own poems of 1815, which reminded him, among other things, of the lyrical ballads and rekindled mixed memories, particularly of the preface in which Wordsworth had originally stated that his and Coleridge's opinions on the subject of poetry do almost entirely coincide. Coleridge soon thought not, if he ever did. His explanation of their disagreement evolved into his own Biographia Literaria, originally intended simply as a preface to his own poems. In 1829, now we're going to get to the illustration part. In 1829, while Coleridge was still alive, Christabel appeared in an annual gift book. These were becoming tremendously popular at the time. There were annuals, there's a facsimile of one on a rear table, and they were very often marketed heavily, and they had a wide audience. There was a large readership of women readers for these gift books. They were actually traded and given very frequently. In 1829, while Coleridge was still living, in this annual gift book, there was, with Christabel, a single illustration, and there it is. Given its subject matter, I think it's a rather chaste illustration. The woman on the right, who looks very demure and almost saintly, is in fact Geraldine, who is, well, shall we say, not a saintly character in the poem. And if you read the lines that this illustration depicts, the lines have Christabel folding her arms across her chest and holding part of her dress over her right arm, but looking sideways at Christabel, who's holding her hands up like this. It's the only illustration of Christabel in that annual. Now, who did this? The illustration was done by a man named Thomas Stothard, who was absolutely famous by that time and had been illustrating works since the late 18th century. Coleridge had known him since 1815. There's a real connection there. 2 years before Coleridge died, he remarked, "The first 2 books of the Excursion by Wordsworth should have been published under the name The Deserted Cottage, and they would have formed one of the most beautiful poems of the language." Now, of course, that was part of Wordsworth's longer poem. It had become, by that time, The Excursion, less successful than the Prelude would become. And it was a part originally drafted also as a separate poem under a slightly different title, The Ruined Cottage. Well, what's the point having to do with illustration? In 1859, when Routledge issued Wordsworth's poetical works in a complete illustrated edition, it took Coleridge's suggestion consciously, right out of Coleridge's table talk, and issued a separate imprint called The Deserted Cottage, also illustrated and published in 1859. But that kind of publishing venture wasn't new. 20 years previously, in 1839, for example, the publisher John Murray had issued a 16-volume extra illustrated edition of Byron's poetical works. By that time, illustrated poetry was commercially not only viable, but very successful and critically popular. So there is the first illustration of Christabel, but Coleridge had actually wanted it illustrated, so he said, 28 years earlier. Now, that's all I had to say, an anecdote about Wordsworth, Coleridge, and illustration, and a little bit of a Yale connection, the letter having been acquired for Yale by one of Yale's own professors. So I'm now going to turn the program over to another Yale professor, Paul Fry.
My talk is about Wordsworth and Turner, and it's about the deliberate ways in which seeing is made more difficult in the two of them. And it segues finally into something about illustration, which is very superficial and trivial, but I hope does in some ways follow from what precedes it. As he works his way into Book 4 of the Prelude, Wordsworth reflects on the unreliability of memory, but also on the lack of coordination between the mind's eye and the eyes in one's head. Now I'm going to read a long stretch, which I will share with you on the screen. As one who hangs down bending from the side of a slow-moving boat upon the breast of a still water, solacing himself with such discoveries as his eye can make beneath him in the bottom of the deeps, sees many beauteous sights, weeds, fishes, flowers, grots, pebbles, roots of trees, and fancies more, yet is oft perplexed and cannot part the shadows from the substance, rocks and sky, mountains and clouds, from that which is indeed the region and the things which there abide. in their true dwelling, now is crossed by a gleam of his own image, by a sunbeam now, and motions that are sent he knows not whence. Just so, he continues, we the author and you the reader have long been incumbent o'er the surface of past time. The simultaneous enrichments and confusions in what one can and cannot see in this passage belong in part to the water as a medium. It ripples slightly from the boat's movement. I know Wordsworth says it's still, but has to be rippling a little bit. It is transparent, a mirror without a taint, yet also opaque, a mirror that does function reflectively. All is confused even more, however, by the reflection of two enablers of vision, the sunbeam at times, but also the self, the frankly acknowledged subjectivity of one's own face in the water, which interposes itself both between what one can see of the reflected shoreline scenery and also between what one can see of the lake below the surface. It is tempting to compare an unpaintable scene like this to the decaying pilings and piers and riverbank weeds of many Constable foregrounds. And Constable is usually the painter paired with Wordsworth. But I don't think it's Constable's strategy to keep us from seeing what is there. What's on the screen is, after all, a very rough sketch. Indeed, selectiveness of vision offers itself too readily to the mannerism that Coleridge most dreaded lapsing into, and no doubt did lapse into himself. No, Coleridge wants us to see what is really there, just as it is without compromise, and not what is altered in conformance with the generalized beauty advocated by Sir Joshua Reynolds, and still the norm in the Royal Academy. So I think we must draw not on Coleridge, but rather on Turner for a comparison with Wordsworth's tendency to make the visible hard to see. And perhaps by that means we can gain a little more precision about that ubiquitous yet elusive topic, the relation between the visible and the visionary in Romanticism. When Wordsworth wrote his Guide to the Lakes in prose, he was perfectly happy to emphasize the visibilia featured in his region, descanting on suitable landscapes and recommending the best color for newcomers' houses. But in his more metaphysical flights, preeminently in the Prelude, he is well known to inveigh against cultivating the fine discriminations of the picturesque, a strong infection of the age, as a pernicious habit. You can notice his sly overburdening of the eye as early as his juvenile topographical poem, An Evening Walk. In the passage I have in mind, he starts simply enough. How pleasant, as the sun declines, to view the total landscape change in form and hue. But then the magic of the crepuscular, the atmosphere as it thickens, begins to erase things. Here vanish, as in mist before a flood of bright obscurity. Here vanish, that is, all things one had seen before, and the scene culminates. Raised by yon traveling flock, a dusty cloud mounts from the road and spreads its moving shroud. The shepherd, all involved in wreaths of fire, now shows a shadowy speck, now is lost entire. This withholding of vision opens out on what it's tempting to call the Mont Blanc theme in Romanticism. That day we first beheld the summit of Mont Blanc and grieved to have a soulless image on the eye which had usurped upon a living thought that never more could be. This is Wordsworth regretting the finitude even of the largest of physical objects, like Kant in the Third Critique, but without rejoicing, as Kant does, that this very finitude discloses the infinite nature of the sublime. But what about Turner? When he paints Mont Blanc at all, he seems chiefly at pains to remind the viewer in every way he can that this is not his focal point, that all the other things to look at push the vast and central summit to the margins of our attention. This view of Lake Geneva doesn't just put the lake in the foreground, but insists that we attend to the almost shockingly varied activities on the near shore. And there in the distance, if we can tear our eyes away from these things, there is that calm speck on the horizon, just another mountain, if it weren't white. Turner plays the same trick in Château Saint-Michel, Bonneville, Savoie, where all the features of the village and its inhabitants receive equal attention. But in addition, should the eye wish to wander from all the daily interactions of the foreground, there sits the mountain along the horizon, a matter of complete indifference to the gossips on the bridge. Even more striking, however, and better known, is the invisibility of Mont Blanc, its chosen absence, as it were, in Turner's Mer de Glace, where the vale of Chamonix, descending from the mountain, full of resting animals and animals searching for food, receives not just some of our attention, but all of it. This is precisely Shelley's approach for the first half of his dazzling poem, Mont Blanc, where the phantasmagoric ravine of Arve is a figure for the intricate evasions of the imagination, subordinate to nothing at all until, suddenly, having hitherto been invisible and unnoticed, Mont Blanc appears, and henceforth dominates the poem completely as sheer negation, as the negation against which, hence dialectically dependent on this negation, the human mind's imaginings create the forms and hues of existence and consciousness. The mountain is an inscrutable whiteness, or blanc, the downflowing source of everything that can be seen in the Vale of Chamonix, a source which nevertheless itself does not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Switzerland. These ways of withholding vision from the visionary, seeming to offer an image while thrusting it to the margins or taking it away completely, together form one approach to the romantic rethinking of Enlightenment poetics. Lessing had earlier said, visual art should not be narrative except indirectly, while poetry should not be loco-descriptive except indirectly. And there is no suggestion in this contrast that poetry and visual art ever have a function other than representing the visible world and offering metaphors for consciousness that are directly derived from the visible world. Romanticism wonders about that. It places an atmosphere, a semi-transparent or even opaque mist or cloud, between the eye and the object, forcing the mind back on itself. This atmosphere is, of course, what fascinates modern viewers about Turner's work, especially his later work, and fosters all the claims about his anticipation of Impressionism and even of abstraction. The confluence of this theme with the smoke and steam of industrialism has often been remarked upon too, as how could it not be? Here, the object of one's tourist visit, Fingal's Cave, is virtually invisible, as is the steamer itself, enshrouded in its own smoke. As we have seen, Wordsworth's interest in the dust covering those who make it is already clear in his Juvenilia, but it is not until later that he identifies the privation of sight firmly with the imagination. Imagination, lifting up itself before the eye and progress of my song, like an unfathered vapor, Here that power, in all the might of its endowments, came athwart me. I was lost, as in a cloud. But wait, Turner, whose quarrel with visibility I've emphasized, was also an illustrator, and the theme of our panel is illustration. A word or two about his illustrations and his attitude toward illustration. He did a lot of this work, especially in the 1830s. Best known and most complete, many of them in the Tate, are the watercolor illustrations for Samuel Rogers's long poem called Italy. That's in 1822, and some of these images could have been repurposed for the fourth canto of Byron's Childe Harold, and also for a poem by Thomas Moore called The Epicurean. There are also a number of illustrations for poems by Scott and Campbell. Without question, the role of these small paintings is quietly subordinate to represent some particular scene or thing represented in a poem. But Turner's preferred technique for these illustrations was the vignette, the creation of a loose oval or other central form that fades into whiteness as it approaches the paper's edge. Turner is not at all unique in this practice. It was the preferred form of illustration, occupying part of a page in a printed book, both in Turner's time and continuing throughout the history of illustration, for frontispieces, chapter headings, and textual interruptions, whenever full-page illustrations are not called for. Perhaps, though, when we consider the complications of what it means to see in Turner's exhibited oils, we could suggest that for him, illustration is a way of showing the arbitrariness of attention, reminding us through what is left blank toward the edges that something else could just as easily have been in view. As Wordsworth puts this sentiment in his sonnet of 1802 called "With Ships the Sea Was Sprinkled Far and Nigh," insisting on the arbitrariness of visual choice, this ship to all the rest did I prefer, as if it had been chosen for a vignette. Let me conclude, though, with a full-scale Turner oil in the Claude manner that offers as its title the promise of an illustration, a literary subject matter similar to that of paintings like Aeneas and the Cumaean Sibyl or Odysseus deriding Polyphemus. The title is Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. But the great mystery, I'm so sorry. Well, I don't know how that happened. In any case, there it is. The title is Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. But the great mystery of this painting, at least to me, is where is the child? Neither Harold nor the poet Byron is anywhere to be seen amid the personages on a lake shore that could be said to distill a single Byronic concept of Italy out of all the places and monuments visited during Byron's Canto 4 tour from Venice to Rome. Authorial point of view disappears into omnipresence, with the vast Byronic ego, in which Turner could so easily recognize his own, both everywhere and nowhere, inescapable yet as impersonal as Baedeker. How easy it might have been, with less imagination, to do what Turner's good friend Charles Locke Eastlake did in 1826. In Lord Byron's Dream, closely recalling Turner's palette, but bringing in Levantine and Greek ruins that perhaps instead recall Childe Harold too, Eastlake reintroduces the author, whose face and figure were as instantly recognizable as Mick Jagger's today, placing him near the center of the canvas, and projects his Turner-esque phantasmagoria from an announced and iconographically represented interiority. Here we see the Byronic ego on display, asleep in a studio pose, perhaps gently mocked in being so diminutive, and projecting fantasies of history in ruins, no longer a sublimated ego. What Byron sees when asleep, we see when awake, and there is no longer a difference between vision and the visionary. Even without referring to any specific scene in Childe Harold 2, Eastlake restores illustration to its subordinate role. I'll add only that the illustrations chosen by our friends Engell and Raymond for the 1805 Prelude are wonderfully insubordinate, bold, independent, and endlessly instructive. Thank you.
I'd like to look at the early history of Wordsworth's engagement with illustration, first by looking at his appearance in The Keepsake, one of the annuals that's already been mentioned here, and then secondly in the first illustrated copy of his own poetry. So in 1827, the first edition of The Keepsake came out. It was an annual, a Christmas gift book, very tied up, as we'll see in a minute, in the gift by a man to a woman that he loved, and tied up in a whole world of eroticism crossing commercialism. It was the 1828 Keepsake was the most expensive of all the annuals at that time. It was 13 shillings. Most of them were only 12. It had an enormous success, and it led the producers to make an enormously enlarged 1829 Keepsake, for which Frederick Mansell Reynolds offered Wordsworth 100 guineas for 12 pages of poetry. And it was not an offer that Wordsworth could refuse because his own sales had been diminishing, and the way in which he was publishing was in the multi-volume collected works, which were actually not only declining in sales, but were expensive because they were multi-volume. And he was seeking a new audience. So publishing in The Keepsake was one way of finding that audience. It wasn't simply the money. But let me read the beginning of the editor's comment on the 1829 Keepsake. The universal approbation which the embellishments of the previous number excited and its unprecedented sale have determined the proprietor to make the most strenuous exertions to render the present as perfect as possible, both in literary matter and in pictorial illustration. In prosecution of this design and on the various departments of the Keepsake, the enormous sum of 11,000 guineas has been expended, and there follows a Latin line, which I'll roughly translate as, if you expect to make a sale, if you're seeking profit, you need to do something. You need to offer something. So it's a Christmas gift book, but the first thing the editor says about it is, look, we've spent 11,000 guineas putting this thing together. It had 19 plates, which was the same number as the first 1828 edition, but they were larger. And I think the key word is the embellishments of the first edition. That is to say, the plates and not the literary content. It was what the book looked like. And the 1829 volume was raised in price to a guinea. And so one thing that happens is that if you offer this to your beloved, and one of the reviewers sort of nicely says, if you offer this to your beloved, trust you're going to be a married man within a year, is this mixture between, I have enough money to give you this, I'm a safe bet for a husband, and an art book. And it's about eros, but it's also about, this is my disposable income. And what Wordsworth was offered, 100 guineas for 11 pages. You could live outside of London for £100 a year with a family. 100 guineas for 12 pages of poetry is an extraordinary offer. But given this audience for which this book is intended, it also then affects what kind of poetry it prints. The illustrations, the embellishments, the plates have taken precedence. So this is the presentation plate, the first page of the 1829 keepsake, and it was expected that you would write something beautiful to the woman to whom you were giving it there. The frontispiece page is this portrait of Lady Peel. And I have to say, when I first worked on the keepsake years ago, I couldn't understand why Lady Peel was dominating me the way she was supposed to dominate the readers of 1829. And then I realized that it was because this Thomas Lawrence painting is in the Frick collection in New York, where I spent a great deal of time growing up in the city. It is the epitome, then, of what a woman should be. And she essentially dominates, or is the aegis under which the whole volume develops. This is the imagined world, and it's a world that takes money. Money to give, money to dress, style, fashion. It's all about representation. And the volume is enormously successful. So that's the first thing. But I'll say something about one of the poems in it, the Triad, as a way of illustrating what appearing in this context does to you as a poet. It's a poem Wordsworth had already written, but here is the venue in which it appears, called the Triad. And the Triad is the three daughters of Wordsworth, Southey, and Coleridge. And they are summoned by his lyre as they're sort of dancing in the mountain landscape. The narrator is standing with a young man, and he in effect says, you could marry any one of these. They're really wonderful. And this isn't some miraculous nymph. These are real people, real daughters. And he describes the poem as elegant and spirited. And Sarah Coleridge, the Coleridge daughter, says, it's exactly the kind of poetry Wordsworth was brought onto this earth to supplant. And if you remember the language of the Lyrical Ballads preface, which we've talked about a little already, about rural and humble life and the language of real men and characters in nature, because that's where feelings are expressed and ennobled by their relation to nature, this entirely social society world, heavily dependent upon the amount of money, suggests that we've moved into something else. The illustrated book isn't simply a creation of the moment. It characterized that part of Romanticism that the Romantic poets usually are trying to pretend doesn't exist, right? The commercial world of their readers. The literary people who were in the 1829 keepsake are quite wonderful. Wordsworth and Coleridge and Felicia Hemans and Letitia Landon. but everybody says it's the plates. That's why you buy the book, and that's why you give it to someone. So that's the first of Wordsworth's full forays into illustration. The second comes when, in 1842, an undermaster at St. Bees School in the north of England, a coastal town to the west of Grasmere, comes to Wordsworth and says, nobody can afford to read you. And I think that I would like permission to reproduce select pieces of yours in a cheap edition that would be available to young people and not the wealthy, the exact opposite of the world of the keepsake. And Wordsworth and Moxon, his publisher, agree to this, that he will allow the selection to be made and the book to be cheaply produced so that students and young people and the not wealthy can read Wordsworth. He had done the same thing with a teacher named Hine some years before who said, I want to publish some of your poetry and I'll do it in this cheap local edition. And Wordsworth had said yes. So Moxon and Wordsworth permit this selection to be made. The poems were out of copyright because Wordsworth is at this point so old that the poems have crept out of copyright. But then Gough, who comes and asks for this, does something else. He sends the collection to a publisher in London, James Burns, and Burns produces a Christmas gift book. This is a fairly late one, rather complicatedly bound, but it's ready for the Christmas sale. That's its title page, and as you can see, it's heavily decorated. And then Moxon and Wordsworth say, we didn't give you permission to produce another expensive book. We gave you permission to do something up in the north of England. And they jump all over him. They get a referee. They get a legal decision. He has to turn the collection over to Moxon, and he's only allowed 10% of the profits. But the book sells very impressively. Its introduction is slightly ambiguous. It says, maybe it's time that we had a selected edition, because after all, there's an awful lot of Wordsworth poetry that would actually turn people off. And maybe we should have the select best pieces, almost all of which are 20 years old at this point, going back to the great days of Wordsworth's productivity. And he sells it. Moxon continues it. The book keeps selling out. There are editions, let me get the dates right, once Moxon has taken it over. It comes out under Moxon, who makes a just slightly enlarged, textually cleaner version, but essentially, as you can see, the book is exactly what Burns had produced. It's better printed. So it comes out in 1843-44. It comes out again in 1847. It comes out again in 1854. The desire for selected poems is very strong, but this book, which in the first edition is 7 shillings, 7 pence, and then the second edition is 6 shillings, it's still not for the poor. And so the book is dedicated to Queen Victoria, oh, I guess I didn't put this on the PowerPoint. And it has a heading, I've already said to this in an advertisement, which says, we want to put this in the hands of young people because, let's face it, Wordsworth is one of our great moral teachings. And then you turn the page and it says, provided you don't read all of that stuff. And here it is, there's the cover, the cover. This is Lucy Gray. This is the original Burns text. And what I want to point to is the way in which I would rather not call this an illustrated edition. I'd rather call it a decorated edition. It's mostly a question of the borders. There is a vignette, as Paul's already been talking about here for this poem, but essentially the page is simply made a visual field. And there are lots of places here. This is To a Butterfly and the Solitary Reaper. To a Butterfly, there are at least two characters of vignette who have something to do with the poem, but a lot of the book is just this way. No illustration in particular, just decorative borders. But it sells and sells. It sells twice as much as the Hines, the original poor man's copy. But I find it impossible to read because there's a limited number of borders. And the borders simply then repeat. And you realize you've seen this decoration on a previous page, and it's entirely unconnected from the poem itself. And yet it sells. As I've said, Moxon produces larger type, produces a cleaner copy, but essentially that's what his text looks like. So the appeal of illustration for Wordsworth, for getting out selected materials of the poems, to be a celebrity, appeals to him a great deal, and so his whole career is tied up with the repeated printings of this volume by Moxon, who simply puts his name in Burns's place. Then, when Wordsworth dies, and this is again to allude to something we've already been talking about, Routledge produces this extraordinary one-volume edition in 1859, heavily plated, beautifully, or as you prefer, garishly covered. So what I want to suggest is this is 59. Wordsworth is dead by this point, but this book seems to me a fair apotheosis of what the last 25 years or so of Wordsworth's career were like. He was inextricably bound to the notion of illustrated texts. Illustrated texts are what sells. He needed the income. And so I think this is actually a fair representation, and the distance between the early volumes of lyrical ballads and the early philosophy of language and this are quite extraordinary. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker is Mike McHugh, who is coming with an armful of books.
Jim and I were roommates back when we were Harvard graduate students, and it really is nice to come up with Jim and to meet you wonderful people here. There have been 3 surprises since I was invited to come to New Haven, a community I am not familiar with. The first surprise was to find out that this institution had the first school of fine arts at a university in 1869. not well known. We're talking about an important trend in the study of material culture, and I'm glad to tell you that kind of from the art side, a lot of people have become interested in illustrated poetry, who are interested in art, and they're being attracted to literature. They're being attracted to poetry even. So it is a very encouraging trend. The second surprise I had was to go to Beinecke. And if you have not seen the World of Islamic Manuscripts on exhibit there, you'll be delighted, as I was, to discover one of their greatest treasures, illustrated in this fine publication, is the illustration of a verse epic from Persia, 1622, that is 60,000 couplets called the Shahnameh. Be sure when you go over to Beinecke to take a look at the illustrated poetry, because it is part of man's yearning to translate these images that we get from poetry into something that we can all see in a certain way. My third surprise was this morning when I went to the New Haven History Museum, Whitney Avenue. Anybody been there? Marvelous place. And what I found in the gift shop was a contemporary book recently published that is the intersection of poetry and painting. Absolutely beautiful. The artist is Anna Held Odette. Anyone here know her? You know her. Her father was an art historian. Her mother was an art conservator. And so the visual arts are in her blood. And she has teamed up with Suzanne Nothnagel, who is a New England poet. Marvelous little book. If you'd like to see something contemporary, run over there and see your great museum and get a feel for what's being done today. Now, my collection of 1,500 cataloged volumes began with an attention to American imprints between the Civil War and the First World War. When you get into this collecting area, you realize that the apogee of the publishing movement in the United States was between the Civil War and the First World War. It had started much earlier than that and has continued since then. The 19th century explosion of illustrated literature, when literacy and book consumption became widespread in our American culture, is the focus of my scholarship and writing. It was inspired by the trends in Britain that we've learned about today, France, Germany. The United States market for illustrated literature became the largest in the world. Artists and bookmakers moved from Europe to take advantage of the abundant opportunities and created here much of the most successful book work of that era. Illustrations are prints. In the language of art, these illustrations are called prints. They can be engravings. They can be etchings, a very different kind of print. They can be woodcuts, a third and very different kind of print, a relief print. They can be lithography. They can even be photographic. During the 19th century, the growing prestige of illustration brought about the phenomena of authors working as illustrators also, and of ekphrastic poetry becoming a significant trend in publishing. So these were some of the things going on. Now, on the table, when you came in, I've pulled 8 modest volumes from the period we're talking about to give you a little idea what they represent in this movement. And after we're done, please revisit that table with a little greater knowledge of what you're looking at. I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with this edition of Evangeline that came out in 1905, because it's the most easy of these 8 volumes to understand. And all of these volumes were mass market publications that were in thousands and thousands of American homes in the time of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. This edition in 1905 is illustrated by Howard Chandler Christie, one of the great illustrators of that time. It is the latest and the only example that I pulled for you that has illustration in full color, such as this. Before, the economics of publishing did not permit 4-color illustration throughout a volume like this. There is partial color illustration on pages with text. And these plates in full color invite to be removed, framed, and put on the wall as framing prints. They were in many a bedroom in this time. And that's one reason these volumes are hard to come by, because they've been pilfered. It's a great edition, pretty easy to understand. We also have what's called decoration. Our previous scholar was discussing decoration. In this field, you have a term for illustration such as this and decoration such as this. The function of decoration is to help create mood or environment the way a binding does. Our second newest in this selection of 8 is from the Roycrofter shops in Buffalo, dated 1903. Has everyone heard of the Roycrofters? Very important in the arts and crafts movement. It was an intentional community. The printing was done right there. The binding is limp suede. This makes it very ephemeral. It is hard to find these anymore. But these were not rare in their time. This was mass market publishing. Thousands and thousands of these were sold to people throughout the United States. They were highly influential, and they brought the common man to literature. Elbert Hubbard, the cult leader of the Roycrofters, was very interested in literature. And so here we have Thomas Gray, Gray's Elegy. The first time many Americans had ever been exposed to Thomas Gray was in this edition. And when you see what the contemporary artists were doing with Thomas Gray, I think you're going to be really intrigued. It's not at all antiquarian. It purported to be non-commercial, but it was very commercial and very profitable for Elbert Hubbard and his colony. We have here something very different from what I've just discussed. This is a joint imprint between John Lane of London, the Bodley Head, and the avant-garde publisher Way and Williams in Chicago. Have you ever heard of it? Some of the most beautiful editions that we collect in this field. This is Green Arras by Lawrence Houseman. Marvelous edition. What's especially intriguing about it is that Lawrence Houseman was the poet, Lawrence Houseman was the illustrator, and Lawrence Houseman designed the binding. So all of these creative arts are together in this edition. It's not that unusual. Did you know Thomas Hardy took a shot at illustrating his own poetry? Most of us don't know that. I was curious about it and bought a copy, and I was kind of glad that Thomas Hardy dropped that idea and went on to other endeavors, because it's not great, but it's fun to look at. And there are also some wonderful examples of very capable visual artists taking a shot at writing verse. And many times that isn't all that successful either. It's a beautiful edition. Take a good look at this. This is probably the brainiest edition. It's 1894 from Houghton Mifflin in Boston. Published a lot of things that I guess you would say were for the better educated community. They were in Boston. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes' The Last Leaf, a poem which he had published first in 1830. It's published in 1894, the year of his death, with his approbation for these designs. He says, this really expresses what I was trying to say. And what's very interesting to me about this, it's the only example I know of, is that they have this very intellectual construct of what the illustration is in this edition. There are two parallel tracks going on. One is what I call the cerebral track. That track has holograph lettering of the poem, a line, and then iconography, symbols about what this means. It's entirely cerebral. Then on the next page, in each case, there is a halftone of a photograph of an impressionist painting. So you're 3 steps away from the original of the art. This was created by George Wharton Edwards, who was a Connecticut artist of great fame and success who lived in Greenwich at the time. Everybody here in Connecticut would have known who George Wharton Edwards was. He was a rock star, very successful artist in his time, illustrating Holmes in 2 different ways. Now, the visceral one, which is his impressionist painting, is executed in black and white. And you have to understand, as a contemporary scholar here, that publishing didn't permit his painting to be reproduced in color yet. But that was not a problem for the contemporary audience, because the contemporary audience was constantly exposed to black and white material that they knew was color. They supplied the color, They imaginatively supplied the color. There was a second thing going on during that time. Critics considered the essence of art to be the line and the form, not the color. In fact, color was suspect. Color was intellectually denigrated by many critics. And so it was thought by many of the brainy people that you shouldn't be looking at lush color at all, that it wasn't right. And at that time, there existed what were called chromolithographs or color lithographs that were for the mass market. Or you had Currier and Ives prints, you know what they're like. They had been printed in black and white, but they had been hand-colored for the mass market. Those were considered to be low class, maybe even trashy, did not belong in the house of a Yale professor. What do we have in John F. Kennedy's birthplace in Brookline, Massachusetts? Kind of interesting. His father was a bank president. His mother was a very well-educated woman. What they had, go there, see for yourself, were black and white prints of great art on the wall. There were none of the colored prints that you could buy because that wasn't a very classy thing. How am I doing on time here, Jim? Keep it going. Okay. We have now two examples of work, illustration, by American women artists. The first we present is from 1887. The Unknown Way by William Cullen Bryant, not a well-known poem, illustrated by Frances Clifford Brown, not a well-known illustrator. But what's important about this is along the lines of what I was just discussing about black and white artwork. This was printed, published by Dutton in New York in the late 1880s at the height of the Victorian look in architecture, in everything else, in design. And she was a Boston Brahmin. And what the upper class thought was great was black and white and simplicity. Look at the cover. It's almost no design. It's so chaste. And so what you're seeing here is an extraordinary peek at what opinion leaders were starting to drive at in the 1880s, that as we went into the 20th century, stripped away decoration, elaboration, and presents it in an extremely simple format that I think you'll find very interesting, with the poem, again, holographic, hand done for the printing plate. Now, in contrast to that, we have another one just 2 years, 1880. This is typical high Victorian. You see this, okay? You see the cover here. It's very elaborate, very interesting, some gold, some silver. And it was illustrated by Elizabeth Humphrey, who was probably the most successful American woman artist in this field. She was educated at Cooper Union in New York, and she found opportunities from publishers to illustrate poetry. Other women got opportunities to illustrate poetry because it was considered to be right for women. And women rose to the occasion. This is a poem by Buchanan Reed. Anybody ever heard of him? He was just dead by that time, but he was a friend of Longfellow. He was a friend of George Sand. He was a friend of Fanny Trollope. He lived in Italy. He did portraits of Longfellow and Longfellow's daughters. He was a painter also. He did a painting from life of Tennyson. He did a painting from life of Robert Browning, Abraham Lincoln, and others. And so Buchanan Reed was very much in the center of American arts, especially expatriate arts. And this is his poem called Drifting, illustrated by Miss Humphrey. Beautifully done. It's images of Italy, kind of interesting. Two more. This is one you need to know about, take a look at. As important in the history of American illustrated poetry as any edition, it's Snowbound by John Greenleaf Whittier. You know it. It is very important. It came out in 1867 with illustrations by Harry Fenn. Harry Fenn was a highly successful New Jersey artist who did paint, but he specialized in illustration. He was one of the great lions of American art at that time. And also important to observe is that our poet says in a forenote, "It gives me pleasure to commend the illustrations which accompany this edition of Snowbound for the faithfulness which they present the spirit and the details of the passages and places that the artist has designed them to accompany." So he was definitely on board with what was being done. And lastly, I'd like to show you another important landmark edition. This is The Deserted Village by Goldsmith with illustrations by Hammett Billings. Jim's father, I found out, was given a later edition when he was a boy in 1914 using these same illustrations. Who was Hammett Billings? Anybody ever heard of him? He was the man who illustrated Harriet Beecher Stowe's most famous title. And so when this came out, he was already known as an artist who had terrific powers to influence the public. Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably no work of literature that has ever had more impact on American society. And so this came out right at the time of the Civil War when we were recovering from that horrendous experience as a nation. And when he presented his interpretation visually of The Deserted Village, Hammett Billings was very well known. These are very adept illustrations that I think bring to mind faithfully an 18th century environment, very much like the author was talking about in 1770 in Ireland. So we can talk some more after our last presenter.
Thank you very much, Mike. We have another Mike now, Mike Raymond, and he has some slides to show, which we'll pull up here. Before Mike begins, I just wanted to say that if you take a look at the illustrated prelude that Mike and I did, Mike is solely responsible for all of the illustrations in that book. He selected them, and it was a huge task. There are 133 or so of them, but it was his doing. In fact, the idea of the entire edition was his doing.
Very kind of you. He was a great friend and a great scholar. And thank you to all the speakers today. But as Jim was saying, this is what I'm going to talk about today. This is what I feel is my area of expertise, this book. And I may add that it came out in 2017, first edition. And we had our grand opening book launch right here at the Yale Center for British Art. It was very successful. And the New York Times, the Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, Helen Vendler wrote an incredible essay about it, and which we then published in our second edition. Professor Fry wrote one for the Wordsworth Circle. Brad Lighthouser did one for the Wall Street Journal. The most important thing is we bankrupt our poor publisher, the great David Godine, because we demanded $40 a book because we wanted grad students to read it and to afford it. And he could have made a lot more money because once it was sold out quickly, the books on the retail market, the secondary market, were for over $350. So Brandeis University Press has the second edition, and I suspect the same thing will happen. And what does that prove to me is that there's still readership for this in illustrated poetry and for Wordsworth. So in 15, 20 minutes, can you explain the Prelude? It's almost impossible. Never mind the fact that there are over 135 images in here, half of them from the Yale Center for British Art. We couldn't have done it without them. And this is the cover of the first edition that we picked. I like the second edition selection better, but let me explain to you why we did this. This is Borrowdale. Jim was talking about Borrowdale, and I want to go to, just quickly for context, if I can get to this. You put it on slides, right, Jim? Yeah, I'm going to use the clicker. That's easier. Okay, you see that? Okay. This is the center area of the Lake District, which Jim's been all over it. I've been all over it. I've been there 4 times. I've climbed Seat Sandal. I've done Grisdale Tarn and all these other areas. But Wordsworth did it way before I did. And on that famous walking tour of young Wordsworth and Coleridge, where they met up with Wordsworth's brother John by accident, and the three of them started on the tour. They got down to Grassmere at the bottom, and they found this old deserted restaurant, the Dove and Olive Inn, and it was up for rent. And they all suggested that might be a good place for Wordsworth to rent, to settle in. John eventually left and went through if you can see Seat Sandal, which I climbed that, and climbed it at the worst area. It was like straight up for 2,500 feet. But over there to Grisdale Tarn, and John was gone, back to his ship. They continued on down below this to Windermere. They came back up. They went to Borrowdale, which is we were talking about, and Coleridge eventually wrote part 2 of Christabel, where he talked about the merry peals of Borrowdale. So it was an important part. Now, if we go back to that painting, I'm going the wrong direction. There, okay. So I thought this was the best illustration for the cover in 2017 because I needed a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. I wanted to illustrate that feeling, that pleasant, elegiac, sublime feeling. And also, something I first learned in Tintern Abbey, and it's in Tintern Abbey, green to the very door. I love that sensation of green to the very door. This is an illustration that fits it perfectly. You know, deep thoughts, emotion, recollected, and tranquility. So if I can explain my analysis of this poem in 15 minutes, I'll start with paradise and childhood. And I have also been here to Cockermouth, so I need to show it to you, right? Okay. Here's Cockermouth and the castle. That has all the history of England in the last 1,000 years and with it. And this was where he was raised for the first 7 years of his life. And in the beginning of the poem, the original beginning, he starts with, was it for this? That one, the fairest of all rivers, the Derwent. Love to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song. and from his Adler shades and rocky falls, and from his fords and shallows, sent a voice that flowed along my dreams. This was his childhood paradise. And we see here some recollections of his early childhood, providing intimations of true love from his mother and his family and happiness. We feel Wordsworth's blissful metaphorical prelapsarian age of innocence here, if we go to that degree. The delicious memory of Cockermouth. And it is, till this day. I've been there 4 times, except one time we went with Jim, and it was just a flood there. Prior to that, it wasn't so pretty. But other than that, it's a quaint little English town. This Wordsworth's paradise where he was reared shows a wonderful landscape with fragrance breathing of humanity and love. But it was only a romantic dream. Tragically, his mother, Anne, passed away unexpectedly when he was just 7. He wrote, "The gravitation and the filial bond of nature and the heart and the hinge of all our learnings and our loves was gone. She left us destitute." Wordsworth wrote, "Nothing was more difficult for me in childhood than to admit the notion of death as a state applicable to my own being." John, his father, passed away next when he was only 13, the breadwinner. Cockermouth was left behind for good. The siblings were separated for years. Wordsworth did not see his beloved sister Dorothy again for 9 long years. Saw his brother John only 4 times in the next 14 years. While the Prelude encompasses many pleasant themes, and it does, and views like Borrowdale, Wordsworth's open-ended melancholy after his partner's death is given too. After his parents' death, I should say. The poem to me has a divinely dark flavor in its emotive, existential, searching nature. This is what I attempted to illustrate. Again. There we go. Okay. Long time, Wordsworth wrote in the Prelude, long time has man's unhappiness and guilt detained us. With what dismal sights beset for the outward view, and inwardly oppressed with sorrow, disappointment, and vexing thoughts, confusion of judgment, zeal decayed, and lastly, utter loss of hope itself. So now we turn to sadness. Wordsworth's upbringing may have contributed to him having 2 natures within him, one of sheer joy, of family love and Cumbria's natural beauty like Borrowdale and Cockermouth, and the other abandonment and perpetual melancholy, almost a pleasant melancholy for me. He wrote in Book 6, "I must rank a melancholy from the humors of the blood, in part and partly taken up, that loved a pensive sky, sad days and piping winds, the twilight more than dawn, autumn than spring, a treasured and luxurious gloom of choice and inclination mainly." It was there. We see it again later in Stonehenge. Well, this is 1793. He's abandoned, left behind by his friend when there was an accident with their carriage. And he passed by Stonehenge in a severe thunderstorm. This was not a good time in his life, personally and professionally. And he wasn't the famous Wordsworth either at this point. Other than Coleridge, few, if any, believed he would achieve greatness as a poet. After walking alone for miles here, overcome with heat and fatigue, he fell asleep in the ancient stone circle, a nightmare, perhaps. Yet he would declare, "My ramble over many parts of Salisbury Plain left upon my mind imaginative impressions, the force of which I felt to this day." It must be like to be a great poet to say and express these things. "I had a reverie and saw the past. I called upon the darkness and it took. A midnight darkness seemed to come and take all objects from my sight. That experience is the quintessential Wordsworthian spot of time, much like those he later found after this at Tintern Abbey and Goodrich Castle, the latter inspiring We Are Seven. A tale of another 7-year-old child like him once, like himself long ago, who could not grasp the notion of death. We are aware that Wordsworth's Prelude begins where Milton's Paradise Lost ends, and for my case, I think the great education I received at Yale on that subject and the great John Rogers who taught me all about Milton and how it's connected to the Prelude, like it was for Adam and Eve after the fall and the classical dogma of original sin. This painting by Thomas Cole really explains it all. When the archangel Michael walked them out, the world was all before them, and where to choose their place of rest and providence, their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. How does that connect to Wordsworth? Yet, and remember, Wordsworth began his own solitary ways in the Prelude in 1799 with a joyful and promising spirit. I go back to the map, if I may. That same walking tour with Coleridge. After they got up to Borrowdale, eventually Coleridge got to Keswick and went back to London and would return later. On that same walking tour, he leaves Coleridge. John, his brother, has already gone back to his ship in Portsmouth. He's young, he's ambitious, he's already written the first edition with Coleridge of the lyrical ballads. He's very confident. He's been given this mission of write the great poem, The Recluse, by Coleridge. And with great confidence, he looks upon this scene, and I will say that Thirlmere is just above Grasmere, and Dunmail Raise is on your left. There's Helvellyn in the background. This is High Hill here, a high seat. High seat. It's about 2,000 feet tall. And this is a 3.5-mile long lake, about a mile wide and about twice the depth of Long Island Sound or so. And he's just sitting there bursting with his abilities and young life and mission. And he said, "Oh, there is a blessing in this gentle breeze that blows from the green field and from the clouds and from the sky. It beats against my cheek and seems half conscious of the joy it gives. Oh, welcome messenger. Oh, welcome friend. Now I am free and franchised where I will. What dwelling shall receive me? In what vale shall with its murmur lull me to my rest?" Remember Milton. "The earth is all before me with a heart of joyous, nor scared at its own liberty. I look about, and should the guide I choose be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. I breathe again." This painting and these words represent another perfect image of green to the very door, but it was not going to change. So then we need to now go to the end of the book, or otherwise, well, I'll be here all night, and you won't like that. So I need to keep going. There we go. Now we're at the end, and by the end of the Prelude, rainbows and puffy clouds, at least for me, have disappeared. We feel now the black blank of things, ultimate truths which we are toiling all our lives to find, which is one of the reasons I'm attracted to Wordsworth in the first place, vanish into the mist. Nature is reduced to absence, darkness visible, and obscurity. Wordsworth recalls standing atop this bleak, lonely mountain on Snowdon in Wales in 1791. So if I can go down one more and I'll get to the cover of our book, which is the same mountain. But Wordsworth recalls standing atop the bleak, lonely mountain of Snowdon in Wales in 1791. When he did this, he was a college student, and it didn't mean anything to him at the time, and he didn't write about it anywhere. If it did, he didn't write anything about it. It was a memory insignificant to his 21-year-old self, according to his letters. He wrote now in 1805, at the end of the book, how he climbed there in meditation to see the sunrise from the top, to see the light. It did not go as planned. A month or two after his brother John's tragic drowning, which we have little time to talk about, but his brother died tragically, and it was a significant loss for William Wordsworth, financially and emotionally, and in every other possible way. There's a long story involved in it, so that was my dissertation on that. He writes that he climbed to a dripping mist, and he was in mourning when he was writing these parts of the book. He was actually literally mourning for his brother. He writes that he climbed to a dripping mist, low hung and thick, that covered the sky, left to contemplate his private thoughts in the dead of night. This cloud informs him not to seek any further a better understanding of life through gallant intellect, but rather to surrender himself humbly to the darkness of the realm of the unknowing. I think often of the very depressed Lear, my favorite Shakespeare play, shouting out, who is it that can tell me who I am? And sometimes I ask myself the same question. Wordsworth was repeatedly thwarted in his quest for ultimate self-knowledge. He loitered and did not love the guise of his scholastic studies at Cambridge. He did not. He did not perform well there. With deep regret, he left his French lover, Annette Vallone, and their daughter Caroline behind in France, married another woman. He was eventually appalled and inwardly depressed, consequent upon the failure of the French Revolution, when he sees the dog returning to the vomit with Napoleon's consecration as France's new emperor. He rejected William Godwin's wild theories afloat and Godwin's philosophy that promised to abstract the hope of man. They all failed him. By the end of the poem, he may be reflecting with genuine humility and wisdom on his long, incomplete journey toward ultimate truths and revelation. Perhaps some of his confidence may be failing, especially after his brother's ship sank with the loss of 263 lives in Weymouth on the 5th of February, 1805, in sight of shore. It was a blow he never fully recovered from. After a lengthy pause to mourn, Wordsworth finished the Prelude in a different state of mind than one he started with. If you read it closely, you can feel it when you read this. I believe I do. The poem concludes, there's illustrations, and we'll just go with what we have. This is the cover of the book, we'll leave it up. But the poem concludes with a dark, unresolved ambiguity. It does. There's no complete happy ending here. No conclusion. Almost as if to say, God, I surrender to the unknowable truth. That's how I look at it. Perhaps by then he realized that nature and idealized beauty are mutable and subject to sudden change for all of us. As we see in Beaumont's Peel Castle. So are you all familiar with Beaumont's Peel Castle? It's a famous painting Hugh Beaumont painted in 1806. He was one of the founders of the National Art Gallery, and he had an exhibit. He had 3 paintings. One was for the Thorn in honor of William Wordsworth and Martha Ray and the whole story. But Wordsworth gravitated toward this one painting, Peel Castle, and it recalled in his mourning still of what a happy day he had when he saw it first. He was going to see his sister Dorothy at Ramside in that area nearby, and it was the day that he heard that Robespierre was dead. good day, happy day. And it was placid scene, beautiful blue, white puffy clouds, what have you. But life doesn't stay that way. And the painting illustrates that perfectly. As far as illustrations are concerned, Wordsworth came late to it because it wasn't really popular when he became famous back in 1800. And he slowly evolved because others were making money from it, and he was wondering why he wasn't, doing the same. So he contemplated it. He wasn't totally against it, but he came late to it. And really, the only significant illustration in his lifetime was Peel Castle in his 1815 book. It meant something to him significantly. So he wrote, I exclusively esteem that love and thought that beauty which Milton sings. But it has terror in it too, he writes in the Prelude. Elegiac sublime. It appears to me an older and wiser Wordsworth at the end of the Prelude was now prepared, unlike the simple child in We Are Seven, to live like Adam and Eve in a universe of death. Freedom, with love and chaos, and he is the poet of chaos, as Harold Bloom said. It's still his era, as far as last time I read Harold Bloom on this. The Wordsworth was the poet of chaos for ourselves. Right? It's about us. This book is about us, about ourselves individually. An unanswerable awe, where all life and time fades into dust, except God, and if it's good enough for a while, great art, too, like the Prelude, can live on, now with us for 220 years. Sorry for the problems with the technology, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to suggest, since we're a relatively small number of people, that instead of having us continue to sit here and ask questions one by one, that we're going to end this formal sit-down session. The panelists are going to stick around to talk with people, and you're going to have an opportunity to look at the books back on the table as well. I think that would make the most sense, and Mike can take his volumes back there and spread them out, and you can take a look at the others. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you.